Hi, folks. We want to offer a quick trigger warning. We want everybody to find what is useful here, but this is, in fact, a podcast about trauma. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself while you're listening to the Whole Again podcast. Thanks.
This is Teddy.
And this is Leslie. Welcome back to the Whole Again podcast.
The only podcast that has tried to end season 1 like 3 or 4 times.
But we're going to do it, folks. This is it.
So in season 1, you're coming to the end. Welcome. Glad to have you. So excited you made it. And part of what we wanted to do in this little wrap-up episode is just kind of do a review. We've been along this journey. You all have been with us. Some of you from the very beginning. Some of you came in a little bit later. All good. And we wanted to do a little bit of a recap, review, and then dig into some of the tensions, the nuances, and have a preview of what we're scheming on for season 2.
So thanks again for being on this journey with us. And so we want to start this episode kind of at the beginning. So we're just going to start by reading the whole framework in its entirety. And then we're going to go through statement by statement and just kind of do a recap. Statement 1, we begin whole. Our birthright includes safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, fundamental needs of all beings.
Statement 2, we embody trauma and healing across 5 layers: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and/or historical.
Statement 3, trauma interrupts. Trauma is the harmful interruption and disintegration of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging.
Statement 4, trauma overwhelms. Trauma is experienced throughout the body-brain, overwhelming our ability to cope with and integrate thoughts, sensations, and emotions connected to an experience.
And statement 5, we can be whole again. Pathways to healing occur anytime we do anything that restores or promotes safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, and moves bodies towards integration and wholeness. So that's the framework in its entirety, and we're going to spend just a few minutes going through statement by statement and just reviewing what it says, making some additional thoughts, and really just sort of trying to deepen the integration that y'all out there in the world are having with this framework in order to kind of set the stage for what we intend to do moving forward. So, statement 1, we begin whole. Our birthrights include safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, which are fundamental needs of all beings. And in episode 1, we talked a lot about wholeness, right? What is wholeness? That wholeness is not that we can have challenges that, Teddy talked about. I can not have use of my hand and still I can be whole. I can not have a hand and still be a whole person. And at those other layers, right, at the community, system, intergenerational, and cultural layers, right, we have a lot of gaps. We have a lot of interruptions, intrusions, fractures into that wholeness. And yet we still, want to start with the premise that we begin whole, right? That there is a state of wholeness for communities, for systems, for cultures, as well as for individuals.
I don't know that I have a ton to add. I think there for me are always these kind of tensions and like nuance between these different pieces, right, of the framework. And so we begin whole is one of those places where, right from the get, we're like, well, but do we really? And so I think that, when I think about wholeness and we talk about wholeness and wellness, right, again, I often reach for that definition from Amelia Nagoski's book, Burnout, which is really about the ability to move fluidly from a state of calm to risk, adversity, adventure, and back, right? So it's not wholeness as a kind of perfect static state so much as the ability to kind of be disrupted and come back. And what trauma is doing as we kind of move to this next layer or this next statement, what trauma is doing as we move to this next statement about the layers is that it makes that kind of fluid move from adversity, risk, adventure, harm, sadness, whatever, back much more difficult terrain, much more difficult to return to, or in some cases, like actually impossible for a period of time, right? So when we talk about embodying trauma across these 5 layers, it is that the traumatic interruption, statement 3, the traumatic interruption is the interruption of our ability to move from calm, cool, good, relatively well, to disrupted, wild, disappointed, powerless, and back.
The other thing I would add here, too, is that this idea of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging being both a birthright, something that our mere presence on this planet should, I don't love the word entitled, but sort of entitle us to.
Love the word entitled.
Love the word. And that those are fundamental needs, right? So we talked about fundamental as being sort of foundational, right? Everything else sort of builds off these foundational or fundamental needs. And I think that so much of the rhetoric in the political, social media space is saying the opposite, right? It's saying that nothing is guaranteed to you unless you are in a very specific gender, race, class group, and that everybody else out there, their birthright is not guaranteed, right? It is not actually a birthright, right? The rhetoric is really focused on people having to hustle for their safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, and contort themselves and step away from their values in order to maintain that safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. And so one of the, I think, real kind of opportunities or offerings that this framework has is this idea of, no, I don't actually have to hustle in order to deserve dignity as a human being. I don't have to contort myself and, give up my dignity or my connections in order to maintain some sort of safety. And I think that the conditions that we're all living in right now is just ramping up on a minute by minute, sometimes it feels like second by second basis, the degree to which people are being told implicitly and explicitly that their safety, agency, dignity, and belonging is not a birthright. It is not guaranteed. And in fact, it is something that you have to hustle and trade and contort yourself in order to just get little bits of.
And to me, part of the, when we talk about trauma, and some of the definitions that we use, especially coming out of the mental health field, is that, it is the threat to the thing, not just the event of the thing, right? So if my safety is threatened, that can also be a traumatic encounter. If my dignity is threatened, that can also be a traumatic condition. And so, as you're talking about, like, we're under these kind of persistently traumatic conditions, the persistent traumatization is that these things are not entitled, right? The story of I'm not entitled to these things, either individually or collectively or intergenerationally, like, is part of the persistent traumatic condition of not having these really fundamental things ensured.
Right. And as we also have talked about, I think in episodes 3 and 4, the lack of access to them, those persistently traumatic conditions, cause people to end up being overexposed, right? And that overexposure is oftentimes the source of what we think of as anxiety or depression or other kinds of mental health symptoms, is that there has been such a profound lack of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging that person's body, brain, nervous system are just on 11, right? They're kind of in hypervigilance or hypovigilance and not able to come back fluidly, right, to that place of calm or groundedness. Okay, should we move on to statement 2? We embody trauma and healing across 5 layers: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and or historical. And, arguably this is really the kind of one of the more, meta or heady concepts in here, because, we're really inviting people in to look at trauma in a much bigger context than how it was presented or described or taught to a lot of us, right? We talk a lot in episode 1 about, part of the critique we had that drove us to creating this model was that the way trauma was taught to us and in our education was really intensely individualized, right? You're an individual person who had some individual experiences that led to, individual trauma responses. And what we see so clearly now in the world is that trauma is not just individual, right? Trauma is happening to groups, to entire communities, to, people who are connected via an identity or a space or a place or an experience or, multiple different kinds of identities. And we can really, again, kind of see in the larger conversation the way that very specifically specific groups are being targeted in specific ways that are very much intended to interrupt or diminish their safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, right? Like, the assault on immigrants writ large, but the very specific strategy of how the U.S. government is targeting those communities and using resources to target in extremely harmful, frankly, illegal ways, right, is an interruption at a collective systemic. And, time will tell, but we might end up looking back in history at 2025 and calling this historical trauma. Like, we don't really know where the end of all of this is going to be, but historical trauma includes things like internment camps and genocide. And, we're not that far, and some might argue have arrived at internment camps in the United States. So this piece requires some kind of broader thinking, broader understanding of these layers. And I guess that, in the time that we've been working on this podcast, the other thing I would say is that the interruptions at those larger layers just keep getting more and more frequent and more obvious, right? Like, I think it was maybe less easy for some folks to see systemic trauma 10 years ago, but now we can, pull up our news feed and point to 3 or 4 systemic traumas that just happened in the last 48 hours. So I feel like the time is germane right now to be thinking about these layers and how interruptions are happening all the time across the layers.
Yeah, Leslie. I mean, I would be remiss not to name, right, the balance of the statement, right? That it's not just that we embody trauma across these 5 domains or 5 layers, but we also embody healing across these 5 layers, right? And so I think in this moment and in future moments and, whatever, relationships that we're in or we're going to be in, there are these opportunities for healing, right? Like, one of the things you often say, right, is that the relationship is the intervention. And so in that context, like, all of our relationships are sites of potential healing. When I was directing this trauma-informed schools project down in New Orleans, one of my internal mantras was, a healer in every classroom, right? Like, what does it look like if the person leading the class is also the most kind of trauma-informed tool in the classroom? I also had lots of dreams of lots of little healers just running around, checking for each other and supporting one another. But really that we need to be in, I want to say, almost ritual recognition of the ways in which we are in healing, in relationships, in the moment, in the past, and into the future. So when I have interactions I got called yesterday, literally, from some dear friends who were like, hey, we're moving through a thing. It's real difficult. We're not sure how to get through this, through this threshold. And, part of the conversation that we were having was really about agency, right? It was so much about, well, what can I do? What is my responsibility here? What accountability do I actually have, right? So when we think about what it is to be in right relationship with one another, when we think about what are opportunities for healing inside of our relationships, especially our intimate relationships where we have kind of all kinds of histories of all kinds of really jacked up and some amazing things that have happened in our families, right? That to say, oh, right, in this moment with this person and the thing that we are trying to build, agency is really important to us. We really want to be able to make decisions. We really want to be able to make decisions together. We really want to be able to repair with one another when we inevitably hurt one another, right? We really want to be able to make better decisions later and not be held to the last worst decision we've ever made, right? So all of those things for me are about, oh yeah, there's healing there. Like, every time we do that, there's a little bit of healing of our individual and in that small group, right, of a relationship, some collective or interpersonal agency. I also get to do a lot of work with transformative justice groups, restorative justice groups. And so much of the conversation is really about, well, how are we literally creating the conditions for people to heal in the moment, in circle? And so when one of my kind of dreams and schemes for season 2, look out, is to be able to have these conversations with folks who are holding those spaces, right? So how are they holding a group, right, in that facilitative seat and taking care of those 4 fundamentals as a way of moving that group in a healing direction? So I think for me, this piece around we embody trauma and healing across these 5 layers is an invitation to both look at what are the jacked up things that are happening, what are the traumatic and traumatizing conditions that we're under, and also what are the things that we are doing and could be doing to make sure that our healing is also happening, or even just the recognition of the healing that's already kind of taking place, right?
We'll talk about overwhelm here in a minute with statement 4, but I think that I just want to add that first of all, yes to the always balancing the trauma and healing. I realized after I said that, I was like, oh, I did the thing that I am super guilty of, which is focusing on trauma and not healing. But when things are so overwhelming, right? When they're so heavy, when, every 2 minutes on social media feels like a total assault on the nervous system, it becomes harder and harder and harder to see what is possible, to see what can be, to see where healing is present. And I would say it also sometimes makes it harder to even diagnose what the problem is, right? The flooding the zone, kind of getting multiple assaults on different fronts, the overwhelm of that, I think, makes it difficult to be like, this is really an assault on our collective agency. This is really profoundly undignified, right? To listen to this elected leader not be able to even string together a coherent sentence, that's actually kind of a hit on our collective dignity, right? And so I think that the thing that I find so helpful, particularly in this statement, in the framework in general, is our ability to really drill into what is that interruption and what is the site of healing, right? So if we know that we're taking assaults on our dignity, how do I work to shore up our dignity, right? Whether that's mine individually, in my family, in my community, in the larger collective. So it's like an assessment, not to be too social worker or clinical about it, but I think it provides a real clear way to be like, that is an assault on belonging, right? The us and them language, everything being sort of, split into two groups, that's an assault on our collective belonging. And so in order to do something about it, we first need to be able to name it. And I think this kind of gives us some ability to do that. So let's talk about statement 3. Trauma interrupts. Trauma is the harmful interruption and disintegration of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. And I think that in the episode 3, when we first talked about this, I don't know how much we covered the disintegration piece in here, but we put that word in here because so much the story of trauma or traumatic events often are these really big, catastrophic or, terrible, an assault or a terrible thing has happened that's this big moment. But what a lot of trauma survivors will tell you was that there wasn't really a big moment. It was this slow erosion, right? And we're using that word disintegration here, where it was a chipping away. And sometimes that chipping away comes from societal discrimination and oppression, right? Like microaggressions, being, as a child told that, something is inherently wrong or not good enough with you, right? Can be a form of disintegration. Having people who are emotionally or verbally harmful in some way, right? Where it's this slower breaking down, this kind of slower or systematic breaking down of people's safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. And I feel like there is just a lot of that in the world where we're taking it from lots of different directions, right? So, social media has lots of issues with how it is run on an algorithm that is designed to stoke fear, right? So those are, as we're interacting with social media, we're likely interacting with messaging that was programmed to kind of disintegrate our sense of solidarity, our sense of community, perhaps our own sense of agency or dignity. And, in relationships, there's lots of disintegration that happens. People don't feel like they have the space or safety or language to speak the truth of their experience. And so they just sort of slowly pull away or slowly cold shoulder. And there's a disintegration of those fundamentals in that relationship.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we have an overemphasis, right, in the U.S. as an overly individualized and state, as a place that really is about individualism. And so it makes sense that we would have this overemphasis on acute trauma, acute things that happen in an instant, and less of an insistence that trauma and traumatic conditions can persist over time, or that these different systems can interact in a way that puts us into an increasingly traumatized state, right? So when Camille Crenshaw talks about intersectionality, part of the orientation around that was about being at the intersection of racism and sexism, two systems that put Black women in a particularly vulnerable place, right? Not necessarily just to discrimination, right? But to be kind of doubly discounted. And so when they are, seeing themselves or not seeing themselves in media, social media, in books and movies and what have you, there's a way in which they are being presented and represented in really undignified ways, for example, right? And so if you are chronically exposed to undignified representations of people who look like you, people who you have kinship with, like that is a persistent assault on your dignity over time and on the dignity of that entire collective over time. And restoring that becomes this really, really tremendous project. I just finished the book, The Dark Fantastic, and I do not remember the author, but we'll put her in the show notes. And she writes about that, the counter narrative necessary, like developing how she writes about how developing counter narratives is necessary when the narratives that we're being handed are so disintegrating, are so assaultive of our dignity and belonging, and that are so restrictive of our agency, right? And that the characters in these stories that she was naming were often also sacrificial, right? So their safety literally over the course of that, series or book or movie or film or TV show was to be, sacrificed for these other characters, typically white characters, right? So even when we're looking at literal literature, we're looking at actual shows, TV, movies, media, what have you, we are in this moment where, are we being dignified, and are the reflections and representations of us dignifying, or are they not dignifying? And if they are not, what is the world of like fan fiction that we get to build together? What is this secondary state that we get to create that is affirming of who we are and how we move? I think that, like, as a creative and imaginative project, is underutilized. I don't know how many researchers are out there. I don't know how many trauma researchers are out there studying fan fiction as like a healing modality for folks who are exposed to persistently traumatic conditions and that kind of disintegration and interruption.
I don't know how many, but hopefully someone. And if not, maybe someone after they listen to this episode.
Go get it.
Hey, you got someone doing some doc work out there? You need a focus for your dissertation? I will just add quickly to that. The sociologist and writer George Monbiot says the only thing that can change a story is another. The only thing that can replace a story is another story. And we've talked in a couple places here about being hardwired for story, and that how we learn through story, right? So I do think that there is something super potent in, narrative in general, but, partially one of the things that we like about this statement, which we talked about in episode 3, is using this more narrative language, right? So trauma being like an explosion or a cleaving or a disintegration or a breakdown of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. Perhaps a mental breakdown too, but that wasn't the use of breakdown in that moment. But that, like, being able to put language to it, being able to say, not like necessarily the details, although that can be very therapeutically useful too, but that this thing that happened is an assault on my dignity. This thing that happened has given me less of a sense of belonging in our relationship or this family or this community. And being able to put language to that is not the only way we integrate things in as a human, but is definitely one of the key strategies many of us use to integrate our experience as a human. All right, so statement 4, trauma overwhelms. Trauma is experienced through the body-brain, overwhelming our ability to cope with and integrate thoughts, sensations, and emotions connected to an experience. We realized after the fact that in episode 4, we didn't actually give as much attention to thoughts, sensations, and emotions connected to experience as we maybe had wanted to. So yeah, we'll do a little bit of that here and talk about thoughts, sensations, and emotions, or as Teddy also says, intellections, sensations, and feelings. Is that how you say it?
Intellections, sensations, and emotions, because I like for things to have rhythm and rhyme. So intellections, sensations, and emotions that are connected to an experience are, the way that we move through the world, right? So as human beings, as Leslie says, our brain essentially is in a little black box. How does it take care of this body that's moving through the world? It gets all this information. And that information often comes through those three channels. Intellection, so it comes through our thoughts. The information also comes through our emotions, our feelings, and then our sensations, like our actual kind of tactile experience. Both our internal kind of interoception and then our, perception, kind of external facing. And so when we're having a traumatic experience or we're suffering under persistently traumatic conditions, our thoughts, feelings, and emotions can become really compressed. They can be really oriented toward only threat detection. So like, is it safe or not? Is it safe or not? Is it safe or not? And all of that really vast and beautiful information that we could be taking in about our environment gets reduced to this very narrow, very survival based, like, is it safe enough for me here or not? What we really want is for that part of our nervous system to be quieter, like it's always going to be there kind of scanning for threats, but for it to not be the kind of dominant thing that's happening in us. We actually want to be able to have thoughts, feelings, and sensations, intellections, sensations, and emotions that are wide ranging, that give us lots of beautiful information about our people around us, about our own self, about our relationships. It's a way that we get to experience beauty and awe. And when we have those trauma reactions inside of our system, those parts of our brain, they go offline, right? So our thinking brain, our kind of planning and cognition side of our thinking falls offline. Our ability to be in emotional and the part of our brain that's really focused on relationships and feelings and emotions also goes off, right? And the only thing that's left is this very like, are we safe or not? How do we get as safe as possible, as quickly as possible? And so when we talk about trauma and healing as experienced kind of throughout the body brain, part of what we're talking about is that expansion, is that kind of getting out of this very narrow safe or not into a more broad what all is happening in my immediate environment. Again, my external environment and my internal environment. And by doing that, that's part of how we integrate our thoughts, sensations, and emotions. The other thing that I always say when I talk about this, and I'm sure that I said before, but Lisa Feldman Barrett's book, How Emotions Are Made, and she makes this really compelling argument about the social construction of emotion, and that, as other scholars have said, like emotions aren't just a thing that happens to me or inside of me, but also between us, right? So emotions can be between people, and that they are separate from, again, in our actual brains, like in our, in the chemistry and mass and physics of our brain, my trauma axis and my emotional centers are separate. So I can have a trauma reaction of what some people would call a fight response or an engage response or a move toward the threat and also be experiencing fear. I won't clock the fear because that part of my brain is quiet while the other part of my brain is helping me survive, right? So I always, always, always want us to be able to separate this sense of who I am that's moving through the world from the reactions that my nervous system is making to keep me safe from the emotional experience I'm having. Those are all different things that are happening at the same time. And so part of what happens when we become overwhelmed is that we can over-identify with one of those, or that, those kind of three bodies are disintegrated, right? And so aren't communicating really clearly to one another.
So on this topic of overwhelm, the other thing I want to point out to folks is that your body brain, right? We talked a little bit in episode 4 about where that term comes from and why we use it, right? It's an intentional attempt to stitch back together the body from the brain, of which we find it often severed in just certainly clinical literature, but also just the general way people talk about trauma as being something that happens in your brain. And it's not. It happens throughout the entire body. And certain things are regulated in the brain, but every day there's more and more evidence that, some things are actually being regulated in our gut as well. And so, more on that in the future of science, if we get to have that. But, I was doing a training on de-escalation just a few days ago. And one of the things I always do in that training is I ask people to try to recall the last time they had like a near miss at something like physical. Like, I don't like to trigger people. I don't want to trigger you all nice listeners out there. But the last time you almost missed that bottom stair, almost, had a car accident or, something almost happened that set off your body's physiological stress response system, right? Where you had that flush of feeling in your body, you had the stomach dropping, the tunnel vision, the dry mouth, right? Whatever it is. And I ask people to really think through, when that happens for you, what are the first three sensations, right? Not what is your mind doing, not what is the story you were telling yourself, none of that, but the physical sensations in your body when your stress cocktail gets kicked on or kicked out. When you get your stress cocktail, like, what is it actually that the sensation in your body? So for
I
me,
like my stress cocktail shaken.
Yeah, shaken, not stirred, and with a twist. Mm-hmm. No, we wouldn't have twists these days, dirty. But so for me, my stomach drops. I get that like tingling sensation in my armpits, and I do kind of get the tunnel vision. So if you can't name that for yourself, that might be a good little takeaway homework to think about. But the point I was trying to make here is that when I ask people to do that exercise, I often ask how many of you kind of knew this, like could identify prior to doing this exercise. And folks, it's usually less than 20% of the people in the room, right? So my observation in doing that particular training exercise with folks over a long time with lots of different kinds of groups of people is that when you ask somebody to identify the sensations that you feel in your body when you are having a stress response, the majority of people can't tell you what that feels like. You actually have to walk them through. Okay, so here's the setup, right? You missed the last stair. What does your stomach feel like? What do your insides feel like? And so I think many, not all, but I think many of us are walking around in the world without a basic relationship with our body brain and the awareness of what happens in our body brain when our stress response goes off. Right. And so that's at an individual level. And if you can't do that, I think it's helpful. So maybe noodle on that a little bit. But also that also means we can't clock it at the collective, systemic, intergenerational, and historical levels. Like what is the stress response at the collective level or systemic level? So this idea of overwhelm isn't, it's a helpful thing to understand, okay, this is a body, this is a system, this is a collective that's overwhelmed, but what are the warning signs? Like, what are the red flags? But like, how do we know that body is in overwhelm? I think is just a really helpful thing to think on. And
then the other part of that for me always is like, and then how do we know when it's over?
Right.
How do I increase my sensitivity enough to know that, hey, my stress system is acting up and those things are kind of happening to me when I'm not in a near miss, but when I'm under other kind of stressful conditions. And then also, how do I know when it's over? And when I work with groups that are in conflict, that's one of the hardest things for them to find is like, I'm like, oh, well, when is the conflict over? And when has there been repair for harm? And like, when have y'all come back to center? And people don't have collective answers to that, let alone whether they have kind of individual answers to that, right?
Yeah, for sure. One of our hopes in this episode was to really be able to like bring the lens way back, right? And sort of look at these statements as a whole. We can the framework can be whole again. But we know that this is a lot, right? Like this is kind of complicated set of things, and we've kind of tried to piece by piece go through them in this season. But if we zoom way out and kind of are looking at this one of the things that we're hoping that folks have is, this sort of framework to be like, when is trauma? What is trauma? When am I experiencing, or my loved ones or my community experiencing trauma? And then where can we also experience healing, right? So that's sort of, the part of the main gist. But the thing I would add as we sort of pivot into this last statement of we can be whole again is I believe, I think many other wise people believe, that we really, really need to be able to vision the world that we want. If we can't vision what a culture or society or political system looks like that centers people's safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, or guarantees or builds people's safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, we have essentially zero chance of being able to build it. So, and there's, many writers and thinkers and poets and, folks have given us glimpses of the future. But I think that there is a tremendous, tremendous need right now for us to be able to talk in some really granular and specific ways about what a world that really, where safety, agency, dignity, and belonging are in fact birthrights for all people, like what that would look like. How do you build that? What systems does that need or not need? Perhaps maybe less systems is part of the problem. And we're like, that theory of civilizations collapse when they get too complex and, kind of all over themselves. But I think that part of the offering when I zoom way out is that this offers us a chance to see and think about and build the world that we want based on the premise that everybody has a birthright to safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, and that systems and laws and cultures can be built on those, right? If we chose to do it, if we focused our political will in that direction, I might be a little Pollyannish, but I believe we could build that, right? But I know for a fact we can't build something if we can't vision what that thing is, or at least some little kernel nugget to move towards, right? We're not going to have all the lines colored in. We're not going to have all the answers, right? But there has to be some sort of ideal that we're moving towards. And for me, I hope this helps people find a little piece of that for themselves and their communities.
Yeah, I like the visioning piece. And I'm definitely somebody who aspires to be a better vision boarder, but do a good amount of visioning in my kind of individual internal practice. And the thing I think about a lot in terms of what are we doing to build the future that we want to be living in is this piece around like, how do we create the conditions for this, right? So you're talking about systems and I'm like, right, like systems and conditions. What are the systems and conditions that we would need to build or lift up or expand if we wanted everyone to experience safety? What conditions would we have to create for folks to really experience belonging? Just to even hop back for a half second to what we were just talking about before, literally people being able to know what it feels like in their body when they do not belong. I think similar to Leslie, there's an exercise that I do often around othering and belonging, asking people to kind of call a moment of othering into their body and what are the thoughts and feelings and sensations and conversations and narratives that emerge from that place, and then for them to shake that off and do the same thing for belonging. And people really can identify them. And one of the things that pops for people often when they're othered is that they experience isolation. And so standing in front of a room of people and saying, how many of you experience isolation when you were othered, right? When your belonging is threatened or taken away or assaulted or interrupted. And then everyone raises their hand and you're like, so the trick is that even when you are experiencing isolation, you still belong, right? There is a way in which you are connected to others. And so, in this kind of humans or herd animals way, we want to be really thinking about what are the ways that we can share and shape conditions that create and sustain and make more easy or easeful or more clear the pathways to healing. How do we create conditions of dignity? How do we create conditions of agency? I think there are lots of ways. I am someone who is all the way here for building an entirely non-copified situation. And so when we think about how do people make mistakes and then experience reasonable consequences and then make other mistakes, which is going to be my personal take on agency for the moment, right? We have to create a condition where those mistakes are not irrevocable or irredeemable, right? And that people are not irredeemable for mistakes or decisions that they've made. And so when I am holding circle with folks, or I'm training other folks to kind of be circle keepers and to hold circle in these restorative and transformative justice ways, that's one of the kind of first principles, right? Is that folks are not the worst decision they've ever made. They're not limited to that, and they're responsible for their own decisions, and they're also products of their environment. Like, both of those things are true all the time. And what we do is really create conditions for folks to experience as much safety, agency, dignity, and belonging as we can inside of the, spaces that we create together, with the hope that that allows for people's nervous systems to shift enough that they then are also creating those spaces in relationships outside of circle.
Right. And then one other thing I want to add on this final statement around pathways to healing occur anytime we do anything that restores or promotes safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, and moves bodies towards integration and wholeness. And so this idea of anytime we do anything? Yes, anything. And, this is really one of the, I think, finer points of nearly 25 years of working up close with folks who have experienced trauma and have trauma histories, is that there is no single answer, right? There is no single intervention. There is no single thing. Trauma is complex, and healing is also complex. And so I was doing a consultation recently with a caregiver of a young person who had experienced a very significant amount of trauma, both in her early childhood and later as a teenager. And the parent said, I said, so what have you tried so far? And they're like, well, we tried yoga, and it was really great. And so we did yoga 7 days a week, and then something happened, and then they wouldn't go back. And then we tried this, and there was this. So the takeaway that caregiver had was nothing actually works. And what my response was, it sounds like actually several of these things have worked a little bit, but you cannot put all of the healing eggs into one basket. I don't know if that metaphor actually works, but said, what would it have looked like if the young person did, the yoga one day and then went to the dance class another day, and connected with the trusted person on a third day, and we're able to move fluidly between those different interventions, right? And I think that for a variety of reasons, not least of which is it's just very difficult and complicated, especially when you're on the outside looking at somebody who is in this place of suffering, that you just want to fix it, right? You just want the suffering to stop. And so you're looking for the thing that's going to do that. And I guess what we're offering in the past is that there isn't a thing, right? There are many things. There are many myriad, perhaps countless pathways to healing, but it's cumulative and it's collaborative, right? Like there's just no one thing, and that's not a diss on any modality or intervention or healing tradition or anything. It's just not been what I have seen actually make a difference in the lives of people in the long run, right? It is layered, it is richer, it is more complex than that. And that's why we really talk about it. Anytime you do anything that rebuilds safety, agency, or dignity and belonging does not mean that you are healed. It means that you have taken a step on a pathway to healing.
There's a part of me who has not been in the classroom in quite some time, but we keep having this conversation throughout the season. And then some folks keep saying the semester. And I'm like, all right, so end of semester 1. I tricked you into a class you didn't even know. So end of semester 1, your kind of big takeaway project for the summer or whatever next season you're moving into is to really take it out and apply it, like use the framework, right? We have been practicing with this framework for a number of years with lots of folks in lots of different circumstances. And part of the whole intention of doing this in this way with this medium and all y'all out there who we are not sitting across from was to get it out there and to have folks use it and apply it to their lives. So yeah, so your big assignment is to do that, right? So it might be in your home, right? With your kind of close people, whether roommates, family members, whatever. You could have a conversation where like, yo, how are we keeping each other safe here? Or how do we make sure that we belong here? And if that feels kind of like, oh, that's a little bit of a lift, right? Think about your own belonging or your own safety. What do you need to feel safety and belonging in your home space? And then ask for those things, right? If you're somebody who needs to have things relatively tidy because that helps settle your nervous system, great. Ask for that. Be like, hey, it's really helpful for me to feel like I belong in this space when things are put away. If you're somebody like me who needs things to be untidy so that it feels lived in, do that. Be like, hey, I really need to have like the occasional pillow on the floor or else I feel like I'm living in someone else's house, right? So start to identify what are those things that allow you to feel some sense of agency, safety, dignity, or belonging. And I always, for me, the recommendation is always kind of start small, like start with a world that you can really kind of wrap your mind, heart, space, idea, imagination around. And then if you're somebody who is like, oh, I got that, build that out, right? Where are the other places where you could see it? For me, I always have a book stack. I'm always reading. I'm always, listening to books. And so I'm often thinking about these fundamentals in terms of characters that I'm reading about or in terms of historical moments that I'm reading about. The historical moment that I'm reading about right now is Reconstruction. No reason. And, Eric Foner has spent much of his career writing about Reconstruction, and he wrote this book called The Second Founding. And his major conceit or his major, point or thesis around around Reconstruction is that it actually was a second founding of the United States in a way that was different than just like, oh, we added a few amendments, but that actually was a reconceptualization of citizenship, of rights, of an understanding of of literally what citizens were and what that meant. So I'm going to read from him here just as a reminder. And because, I don't know, the only podcast that always comes with a book reading from Teddy. All right. So what he writes is, the amendments both reflected and reinforced a new era of individual rights consciousness among Americans of all races and backgrounds. So profound were these changes that the amendments should not be simply seen as an alteration of an existing structure, but as a second founding, a constitutional revolution, in the words of Republican leader Carl Schurz, that created a fundamentally new document with a new definition of both the status of Blacks and the rights of all Americans. And that Reconstruction can also be understood as an historical process without a fixed endpoint. The process by which the United States tried to come to terms with the momentous results of the Civil War, especially the destruction of the institution of slavery. And so when we think about Reconstruction, right? So for me reading that, immediately I'm thinking about agency because I'm thinking about rights and citizenship. I'm thinking about collective dignity, folks who are taken from a position of chattel slavery to a position of human, right? Or, well, from a position of non-human to human, right? So a dignity piece there. I'm thinking about belonging, which is also a citizenship question, like who belongs here? And I'm thinking about agency, what did I say? Agency, safety, dignity, and belonging, right? So like who all belongs to this particular polity. And so so I'm reading Reconstruction books, right? And I'm thinking like, this is a process by which we are trying to systemically deal with this really intense harm to our collective safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. So it doesn't have to be just like, hey, how do I apply this in my life? If you're somebody who's like, I'm an historian, all I do is hang out in these books. I'm like, cool, pick up the book and be like, where does this live in that context? If you're reading fantasy novels like I do, same thing there, right? Like where are all the places where this framework could live and how do you see it? And what does it help you notice when you're in those worlds?
Right. And if you're not reading history or fan fiction, you could apply this to reality television. You could literally apply this to whomever you're passing your time with on the screens.
I know nothing about reality fiction. I can't help you with that. Reality TV is not my
I don't
space.
either. I don't watch any reality television. But I actually think that you can see a lot about kind of current norms and cultures around safety, agency, dignity, and belonging on some reality television. So, yeah, I think that the kind of additional sort of, end of semester practice is being really mindful or being aware or taking notice when something happens in your life, when you take something in or you have an experience that really is a little bit of an assault on your safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. And then seeing what you can do to rebuild a little bit of that, right? I mean, I know I've used social media examples a few times today, but I kind of do feel like every time I open my social media feed, I feel less safe. I feel less of a sense of agency. I feel profound hits on my dignity, and I'm not even sure what to say about belonging in this moment. And so one of the kind of tactics I've been trying to use in addition to just kind of critical thinking and not trying to just react to every single thing, right, which is its own practice, is to be like, okay, where can I go shore up my dignity? Where do I feel a sense of agency? Where do I feel a deeper sense of belonging or safety? And try to go actively seek those things out. In many ways, kind of as a like a remedy or an antidote to those interruptions, right? Like we talked about Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and how the main character who has hyper empathy has to take sips, right? They can't just constantly be subject or witnessing to violence because they will take on or experience the pain or sensation of what they're witnessing. And so that ability to take sips, that ability to restore or shore up one's safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, especially when we are feeling multiple assaults on our safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, just as sort of we're walking through the world. And then I'd say a more advanced practice is try to apply this to people or situations for whom you are hurt, angry, frustrated, that you're not feeling a whole lot of like your deep well of compassion for, right? Mm-hmm. So, one of the things I often do when I'm reading about the current, for lack of a better word, political leadership, is I spend a lot of time going, that right there, that's super messed up. That's a bid for agency. Right? Or that's wow, they must be really having a hard time because they're trying to get some dignity by doing this in our current conditions. Usually they're trying to get dignity by making other people feel profoundly undignified. But just to be able to look at folks who are doing harm, actually, who are actively doing harm and say, not why is it okay? Because it's definitely not okay. But how does it make sense? Like how does that behavior make sense? Because there is a tremendous amount of strategy that we can pull out of understanding why, even if it's the most messed up thing in the world, why that person is doing what they're doing. What bid for safety, agency, dignity, or belonging is this rooted in? Because it won't give us all of the answers, but I think that it just makes me a little bit better to at least go, okay, well, that's awful, and we need to do something about it, and it's messed up. But I do understand that what they're doing is a bid for agency right now. And then how can we use that to actually strategize towards solidarity and towards the conditions that we want to create for everybody?
Yeah, and if you are not quite as an advanced student as Leslie is, I think there's an invitation to take it kind of one step down from that. And like, what about those things that these folks are doing, again, terrible as they may be, is appealing to folks?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, why is it appealing to tell someone that they have dignity because you're doing undignified things to other people, right? Like, why is that? Right? It's like, oh, well, that's why, right? Like, if we say this thing and we call them these names and we, demonize them this way, then we can feel more dignified. You're like, oh, right, that makes a lot of sense. Why that would be appealing to somebody. And you can either take it from the strategic place, as Leslie was just saying. You can also take it as an empathy, compassion building exercise. You can take it as whatever you want to take it. But the recognition of, oh, even the folks who are doing things that I disagree with or that I find abhorrent are still humans, are still part of our herd, and are still trying to do a thing and exist within these fundamentals. And if their fundamentals, this is definitely my editorializing, right? If their fundamentals weren't so under threat and weren't so fractured, then that appeal to their dignity wouldn't have so much power.
Right.
So it's also about, again, like, what's the really enticing world that we're building that says, no, you can have dignity over here and you don't have to demonize anyone to do it. Like that, like both of these things are true.
Yeah.
So I think there's a strategy piece, there's an empathy piece, there's a compassion piece, and there's what is the world that we want to be living in piece. And the world that I want to be living in is not one in which we can just kind of dominate folks that we disagree with. Like, that's just not what it is. But it is to create a kind of stable enough, dignified enough, safe enough, belonging enough, agentic enough collective body that some of these really horrific things like cannot happen, right? Like how do we make them actually impossible? Because people would say, absolutely not. I refuse to do that. That's unbelievably undignified. How could you even ask me? Right. And right now, that's not what folks are experiencing for the most part.
Right. Well, that seems like a really good place to wrap up our conversation, our overview of the 5 statements.
We also have to wrap up because my fizzy water is empty. So
yeah, fizzy water's empty. Time's here. Bio needs are emerging. Life is happening all around us all the time. But we want to wrap here and just talk a little bit about our hope for next season. This season, if it was a season, are we wrapping this?
This semester's over.
The semester's over.
You have your homework assignment for the summer, your summer reading list. And when you come back with questions.
So actually, speaking of reading lists, if you go to wholeagainpod.com, what you will find is we have a bookstore there at thewholeagainpod.com. And every single thing that we have referenced in the first 6 episodes is there, and a bunch of other stuff that Teddy and I draw on heavily that maybe we didn't name check specifically, but we consider sort of foundational to the building the framework. And our hope for season 2 is really to pivot from this is the framework, here it is world, thanks for listening, to putting it into practice, right? Into practical application, into lived experience, into dreaming, envisioning, whatever that may be for you. So if you have questions for us, please, please, please email us or put a message through thewholeagainpod.com. If you have suggestions of people you think we should talk to, we're intending to do interviews in season 2 with people who have been working with the framework for some period of time, who are either healers or practitioners, and to get a sense of, how folks are actually using the framework out in the real world. So if you have a suggestion of someone you think we should talk to, please let us know that. And if you have questions about the framework itself, or just things that you think Teddy and I should know about this framework and what we've put out in the world, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Any hopes and schemes and dreams for season 2 from you, Teddy?
No, I mean, those are the hopes and dreams. I hope that we get lots of questions and comments and lots of homework assignments turned in about people like, oh, I applied the framework in this way and that way, and suggestions of folks to talk to. And that we really do get to bring it out into practice. I think this was kind of, the 101, semester 1, foundational, and then really interested in moving with y'all into a season of practice, to a season of practice and reflection. So that is the hope and the dream.
So thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you being on this journey with us. And we look forward to coming back in season 2 and picking up where we left off here. So thanks for everything that you do to bring safety, agency, dignity, and belonging into this world. Thank you to my amazing co-host, Teddy, to our producers, to Sylvia and Dane, our producers, our audio engineers, and all of our community.
Shout out to Northwest Live. We're recording today. Thank you, Keegan.
Thank you. And just really to everybody that has helped us in one way or another, has given us feedback, has, just helped us refine this to the point where we thought it was ready to share with the world. So thanks for letting us share it with you. Be well.
And share it with someone else.
Yeah, also, anywhere you get your podcasts.
Be easy. We out.
Thanks, Teddy.
Thanks, Briner. Peace.